Okay, you ready, John? All right, we're back.
Are we back up?
We
Great.
are back up.
All right, so now that we are back from the break, we can continue with the rest of our agenda for this evening. And so the next item, as I had mentioned, is the monitoring report for results 2, academic content, knowledge, and skills. And just to remind you, this is part of our whole process of coherent governance, and that we receive the monitoring works on our 3 results as well as the 13 operational expectations. So this is actually our first one we have received after we revised. So you had that report. It was rather lengthy. So you had the summary at the start with all the graphs as well as the appendix at the end providing some oversight. So tonight they will present it and we'll then have the opportunity to discuss approval. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Stable.
Thank you. Yes, you know, as we've talked about these are extensive, and I think that's one of the things that you'll need to consider long after I'm gone with Dr. Holman. But I also think that some of what you're going to have to consider, obviously, for next year is because of the closure, and what really are going to be the biggest priorities in determining what learning looks like over the course of next year. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike Van Orden to walk us through some of the things that we can tell with certainty, and then some of the things that leave us maybe a little bit lacking because of the nature of the goals that we've set as aspirational goals versus what that really tells us about achievement and what we might want to think about moving forward. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. So as a little bit of a set tonight, I wanted to share some background. As you know, and as you mentioned, we have adjusted the way that we share monitoring reports. We used to share by a single content area at a time. And with this monitoring report tonight, we're going to be reviewing 7 academic areas that fall into this category. We also made some adjustments on, again, the inclusion of multiple indicators within each area. We have some new indicators that we're looking at. We also set targets for each of those, and I think at the end we'll talk a little bit about some of the recommendations we're getting from the Aspen group who we're working on with this report, just how we might think about those in some new ways and some different ways. But specifically, as Dr. Stavum mentioned, we set those targets to be aspirational targets, which are things that you're thinking about much longer term, versus shorter, maybe 1 to 2 year targets where you're looking for smaller incremental improvements. And so that'll be something to keep in mind tonight as we're looking at our results and how we're approaching those targets. But again, the targets we set are much higher than, again, something you'd probably achieve in a year or 2. In addition, because we are including so many more areas and we have been reviewing the indicators that we're looking at as well as the targets, we're reporting much later than we typically do. Usually we're reporting these in the fall. And we're doing that because the data that we're using comes from the prior year. And so it's usually data that we've had a chance to review and discuss and put into a monitoring report. As I mentioned, we get a lot of that data from our state assessments, and as you know, those assessments are going away. So we'll also want to be thinking about just the new world as we move into next year, not having assessment data for this year. Finally, we want to be thinking about what do we do with the information that we have. And so we will provide you a high-level overview of the results, but typically where we spend more of our time in the discussion is, well, what do you do with this information? And in normal times, we would have a long list of things that we'd be working on to address the results that we share with you. As you know, we're moving into a very different world. And when we started this monitoring report, we were living in kind of an old system, and that made a lot of sense, and that system's changed. So we'll talk briefly about some of the specific things that we're working on tonight, that we'll be working on longer term, that will address learning in more of a remote or a hybrid of a remote and in-person. And specifically, we'll talk about some areas we think are most important to focus on initially. So what I'd like to do tonight then is take you briefly through the results themselves. You have much more detail in the board packet that I'm sure you've all spent some time looking at. And then we also will, as I mentioned, talk really more specifically about what our next steps are. As I mentioned, 7 academic areas that we're looking at tonight: literacy and language, math, science, social studies, computer science, information and communication technology, the arts, and world language. And as you recall, we spent quite a bit of time defining what each of those mean. And so for literacy and language, there were a number of things that were built into that. Things like literacy and language skills that help students to comprehend, create, respond to text, reason with evidence. Quite a bit to unpack there. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about, well, how would you know if students were able to do all those things? And again, towards the end of our meeting tonight, or the end of the presentation tonight, I'll share with you some of the Aspen Group's recommendations about the indicators that we're using to represent some of those. But specifically for literacy and language, this is probably the area that we have the most data and the most information to look at to determine how well we're doing. So for example, at the elementary level, we have our DIBELS literacy assessment that lets us assess early literacy and early reading skills all the way up through some basic comprehension skills and fluency skills. And then we move into some more of the things that are described in the description of literacy and language that we've created that are embedded in our state standards. And so we assess those through Smarter Balanced Assessment. We also, as you know, have assessment that we use for English language learners, our ELPA 21. And as I mentioned in earlier conversations we've had as we've been developing these, most of the standards that we are talking about live within our courses and in our course content. And so we looked at course grades as a reflection of the entirety of a course that includes the standards for that grade level. So looking at all of those, overall, our students are doing well. They're getting very close to those, as I mentioned, aspirational targets in most areas for the whole student group. But as we've talked about over the years, when we look at subgroups, there's some pretty significant differences. And we have quite a bit of data by subgroup in the report, but what I tried to do, just to give you a high-level overview, is I took our annual assessment results for each grade level and just put them all together as a composite, and then looked at by area, where do we see gaps between subgroups and the all-student group. So for example, if you take the composite of DIBELS and Smarter Balanced Assessments in grades 3 through 10, you get about an average of about 85% proficiency. But if you look, for example, at our Black African American students, there's a proficiency level that's lower than that. And again, also if you look at some of our other groups like our English language learners, students from low-income households, and students with disabilities, we do see some pretty significant differences between achievement, performance, and that all-student group. And then even if you're looking between groups, you see some differences. So we recognize this is a continued area. And as I was mentioning earlier, we may want to be thinking about shorter-term specific goals that we're working on to start making progress in these areas rather than continuing. We want to continue to have those high aspirational goals, but we should probably be thinking about some shorter term goals to work on in these areas. So if we talk about just this portion of results, we believe there's partial achievement of the result in our overall results as we get closer to that aspirational goal. But as in all the areas in this report for our subgroups, there still continues to be quite a bit of work to do. And there's much more detail about these in the packet that we shared with you tonight. Similar for mathematics, fairly high overall results, but there's a caveat to that in that if you look at all 7 of our areas and how students do year to year in terms of growth, how they do in relation to other school districts, math is an area that probably is the area of greatest opportunity and the area that needs the most attention. And we'll talk about at the end some things we're thinking about for math. But particularly if we're just comparing this to other academic areas, it's probably our lower performing area relative to the other academic areas in R2. At the same time, relatively high performance in comparison to other states. We're second or third among comparison districts, but a similar pattern that you see for our subgroups. And again, pretty significant gaps in achievement that most likely relate to opportunities that our students have in our schools, and that the ways in which we distinguish and differentiate the way we deliver instruction to students. And so this is on us to think about how are we identifying the needs of our students, and then what do we do when we see that there are greater needs for individuals and groups of students. And again, thinking about shorter term goals that would allow us to be more nimble as we work on responding to those. So again, as in all the areas, this is one where partial achievement in terms of our overall results, but still work to do in terms of our subgroups. In science, we are looking at strong overall performance, getting very close to our aspirational targets. ranking second or third in benchmarking districts. The 11th grade results are more a reflection of the participation as opposed to achievement. Because there wasn't any graduation requirement for this assessment, it didn't link to anything that students were accountable to. Many of our students said, why would I do that? And so we had about a 21% achievement, but that reflects many students who didn't take the assessment. So what I did for that group, for the subgroups to share with you in this presentation tonight, was to show you the data that we felt like represented more of our overall student body. And again, we see some pretty significant gaps by subgroup. So now we're moving into academic areas that don't have as many state assessment results that go with them, and that'll be something we talk about here at the end as we're thinking about how we monitor this in the future. So for social studies, we were looking at the students who earned a C or higher in social studies classes by the end of 10th grade. We also have a target on here that's for the future, and that is students earning a C or higher in civics. That's a standalone course starting next year. So for many courses, it's been embedded in the course content. There was new legislation that came out that said, no, you now need to have a standalone civics class. So that's something we want to keep on our indicator list, but know that data won't be coming until next year. So here, this is an area where we actually exceeded our target in our overall results and are seeing a slight increase in the trend. And for many of our groups that weren't performing as well in some of our other academic areas, they were hitting target here, but again, we still see some of those persistent gaps that, again, we've been wrestling with for many years, as well as every school and district in the nation has been wrestling with. Computer science, information, and communication technology, we used our standards-based report card at the elementary level, and again, remember we had that conversation about there's a lot to unpack in these statements, and so what are the best indicators we have currently? We also talked about if we could create an ideal world, we probably want to be looking at other indicators, but for these we do have our report cards, and so for grades 3 and 5, in grade 3 we were looking at getting very close to our target, and in grade 5 we hit our target. Here again, most kids are getting very close to that target, if not being right on the edge of it. So this is an area where we're seeing kids are getting exposure. I think we had some conversation earlier in the year about, okay, this tells you that they've had access to it, but then are they actually able to apply it and use it in meaningful ways? And so this could be an area that we want to be thinking about, but again, right now we have grades 3 and 5 data. For the arts, we again use that target of earning a C or higher in an arts course by the end of 10th grade, and we're well above the target that we set for ourselves. And for the most part, our students are getting close to that target or exceeding it. And then finally, for world language, we had 2 areas that we looked at as targets. One was world language credit, as well as continuing to increase the number of students who are working on that seal of biliteracy. And we set again some aspirational targets there. We exceeded our target for world language credit, and we continue to increase the number of students who are receiving the seal of biliteracy on their diploma. And then again here, by subgroups, you can see that there are still groups of students for whom that is not. World language credit is still an area of work, but something to point out here, if you look, for example, at our English language learners, the seal of biliteracy is an opportunity for our students who speak English as a second language to demonstrate competency or demonstrate their ability to speak in a second language. And so you see a pretty significant increase in the number of students that are taking advantage of opportunities to demonstrate mastery of world language. And that's been the result of some pretty significant efforts on the part of Jen and her team to increase the ability of students to get that seal of biliteracy. So, as I mentioned, we were looking at a whole series of academic areas. In the past, we've reported on individual academic areas, and we focused very much on literacy, math, and science. And then we, in the past, have given updates in the other content areas. As we were working with the Aspen group, they had some comments and some feedback that was similar to our conversations that we were having, in that for many of the academic areas, the indicators probably weren't sufficient to give you the breadth of understanding of whether or not students were really demonstrating all of the things that were in those descriptions that we created. In addition, they were also saying, as we're moving into, and we've been talking about this as well, as we're moving into this very different way of thinking about education, we should also be thinking about how do we take advantage of the conditions that we're in and actually really hone in on some very key important areas. And so these were, in a conversation with Aspen Group, some recommendations that we have to think about as we move into monitoring for next year. One is that we focus on fewer higher leverage areas and goals for monitoring, and in particular, literacy, math, social and social emotional falls in another results area, but again, to think about these as what are we going to really be paying attention to as students begin re-entering our schools. In addition, as I was mentioning, we had some conversations about aspirational goals, and we think those are still important to keep, but we should probably also be thinking about some shorter term, more specific goals. And there's a number of different models. One is this idea of a SMART goal, where you have very specific targeted goals that are measurable in the short term and achievable in the short term, so that you're making incremental progress. Because I think we've been having this conversation for a year of these high aspirational goals, and how do you know you're actually getting closer to them? They also should be goals that could be achieved in a relatively short span, so maybe 1 to 2 years, and that you have that time-bound target of within the next 2 years, you should see this much growth. And so again, we can look at setting those smaller, shorter-term targets, looking at other schools and other districts that have shown that kind of progress. We can look at our growth trends and our growth data to see what would be reasonable to accomplish in a couple years, and then really work hard to reach those goals so that we could start saying, we may not have all of our groups getting to these high 95% marks, but we can show clear evidence that we're making progress in that area. In addition, we're going to have to think about new baseline data that we'll have, because we won't have state assessment results next year. And so, as I was sharing at the beginning, literacy and math have lots of data that we can look at that we won't have that for next year. And so we'll share with you some ways we're thinking about gathering that data. In addition, we want to make sure that our teams and our folks are really focused and putting lots of energy and effort into reentry. And so we know that more than anything else, literacy is one of those foundational skills that if you don't have it, all your academic areas are impacted. In addition, we know math is a major gatekeeper for college and career, and so those are areas that we recommend very highly that we spend quite a bit of time looking at, monitoring, and focusing on as a team, and monitoring very closely. So the other academic areas we would recommend that we continue to monitor, but we really think about those like we used to in the past, of having spread out updates on our progress in those areas, continue to make sure that we're looking at whether or not students are passing courses, because that's going to continue to be an area of concern as we have some form of remote learning, some form of hybrid, and some form of in-person. We need to keep an eye on that. But trying to do all of this in a condensed way, just given what we've seen so far this year and some of the conversations we've been having, that would be something we'd want to be thinking about for next year. So, as I shared, this points us in some directions, particularly as we move into this new world of education. And I do believe we eventually will get back to kind of normal, traditional, in-person learning that we know how to do. But we have some time here that we're going to be in a transition phase. So we're thinking about a number of things that directly relate to what we're seeing in our results that inform our practice. One that we're having a conversation about right now is summer school. We're leaning more towards a remote version of summer school. We're keeping the door open to the idea of some form of in-person, but just reading the writing on the wall, we may not even be allowed to offer in-person summer school. In addition, we're thinking about who probably needs summer school the most. So we know, for example, we have students who are struggling in literacy, and you saw that in our subgroup data, and as we know that's a key important skill. So we anticipate there's a need for some level of intensive literacy support for kids, primarily in elementary, but some in middle school as well, that would focus on reading. We also know that we have students with dyslexia and students who are so far behind, we need to accelerate them just to keep them up to speed. And so we are exploring and thinking about how would we do that with a much more robust form of, if it's remote, in-person live instruction, probably in small groups with some built-in time and a regular time where there's a teacher and a small group of students that are getting some literacy instruction. In addition, we're looking at programming for EL and special education over the summer. Again, though, if it's remote, we're needing to be careful that it's students that are actually able to participate in remote learning. So all of the things we've been doing to get kids access, we need to make sure we're doing now. And if we have kids that it's just not working for, we're going to need to be thinking about into the school year. And so we can give an update more on what we're thinking about in those areas in a future board meeting. But no, that's an area we're really attending to and thinking about. So as we move into the fall, without the state assessment data, and just as we've been looking at all of the different blueprints for reopening, one of the first things we'll want to do, and this is when I say first in terms of academics, because we also know we're going to need to have kids learning new routines and transitioning back into schools. But within the first month, we're looking at the need to have a form of universal screening, which means every student is assessed for literacy and math in grades K-8, so that we can get a sense of lost learning, we can get a baseline, set of baseline data for students that we can use then to monitor to make sure that kids are making growth. Because we know, as I mentioned, the world's going to be very different when we come back. In addition, we'll be thinking very carefully about small group literacy instruction that can be delivered both in person and remotely. And as some of the community comments mentioned tonight, we're hearing more and more about the potential for surges to come later in the fall. And so we might be starting with in-person learning, and then we may need to switch to remote for a time, and we need to be ready to go with really robust remote learning so that when we come back to in-person learning after a surge maybe goes away, there can be more of a seamless transition between those. So that will include everything from using our existing digital and print resources in person and remotely. We also have, as you know, we shared in the past, new dyslexia curriculum and curriculum for our EL learners. We also are going to continue to focus on providing professional learning for our staff in the areas of foundational literacy and dyslexia. We started that for K3 and we'll be continuing that for 4-5. Some of that may need to be remote for our teachers. So just like we're thinking about remote learning for our students, we're thinking about remote learning for the adults in our system as well. And we have a learning management system that allows our teachers to access professional development online. In addition, we're looking at how do we expand the use of digital tools, and we had a question earlier about what kind of feedback are we getting from our community. There are some of our digital curriculum that's a bit older, and so that's curriculum that we'll be reevaluating, but there's some new digital tools that we are using that we're hearing very good things about. So those include Lexia, which is a literacy program that we're using at K5, Dreambox, it's a math program we're using at K5, and Alex, which is a math program we're using at 6-8. Not that it works for every single kid, but we're getting much more favorable recommendations around these. Parents are seeing them as much easier to access. Students are reporting that they're more engaged in them. And so we are looking at how do we expand access to those. Kelly Pease right now is looking at digital licenses for Lexia for all students in grades K5, where we used to have it for a more targeted approach. In addition, we've been hearing quite a bit about our math program at the elementary level, not only in terms of remote instruction, and parents are expressing some concerns about that, but also just this is an older curriculum, and we were planning on a curriculum adoption for K5 math a few years out. We're going to accelerate that process so that we can be looking at a K5 math program much sooner. So again, something that would probably be more useful and more teacher and student and family friendly, that would include much better digital support. So again, we were thinking about that beforehand, but the change to remote learning really accelerated that and created a much higher need. Finally, we are looking at reading acceleration courses for grades 6-8. We're also, as you heard tonight, moving through our ELA adoption, and at the 6-8 level, we are really thinking about programs that will be able to be effectively used in person. We always want that, but also if and when we start having to transition back and forth between remote and in person. And another big area that we'll have to be thinking about with the number of students that haven't been able to access, even despite many efforts to give kids access, are our credit recovery options. We have a fairly robust credit recovery program right now. We're probably going to need to expand that both in person and remote during the school year and during the summer. So many of these things we were planning on even before remote learning, but they become even more relevant now. They're very tightly connected to our results, but also to the feedback we've been receiving from families, and we will be working through these different strategies as well as many others. As I mentioned, you might be thinking about, well, what about social studies, and what about the arts, and what about computer science? again, we need to really focus right now. And so, not that we won't be attending to those other areas, we'll be monitoring credit, but we really strongly recommend that we're very closely monitoring these to make sure that kids continue to make gains, even in less than ideal conditions. Finally, just some larger district strategies, again, that support remote learning and that are part of our larger district efforts, not only in remote settings, but when we are more in person. Our multi-tiered systems of support structures to have building leadership teams that are continuously looking at that data we're talking about that we'll be gathering and thinking about what are the strategies and interventions we're going to be applying at the building level to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our kids. We will continue our work with our partners, including the TIE Center, University of Washington, and the SWIFT Center, to continue to build more inclusive learning communities in all of our schools. As we were talking about earlier tonight, that's much more difficult in a remote setting, but we will be back in person, and we want to be thinking about making sure that all of our students are connected to their home schools and feel like they belong. Our families are connected to their home schools and feel like they belong. And so these partnerships are helping us to get closer and closer to that. And in particular, our TIES partnership is going to be helping us look at instructional practices that teachers can use so that they do a better job of making sure that kids with disabilities are in their gen ed settings, learning and being members of their communities. In addition, we're continuously thinking about our equity efforts. As you saw in much of our subgroup data, we have students that are not as well connected to school. And so our culturally responsive teaching and family supports will be continuously important as we move in that direction. So lots of work continuing to happen, but it needs to be targeted and focused. And so we'll be sharing more about how these fit into a larger plan in a little bit, but this is essentially our thinking as we move forward with the data that we've captured from the results monitoring. And then overall, we are making the assertion that we're in partial compliance, we're partially achieving our results, but there's still quite a bit of work to do for our subgroups. And that's the end, I believe, of our presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. At this point, I'd like to just sort of, if there are any questions or, and I see many a hand up. So from that, I will start. I believe Mark Stewart's was up first, so Director Stewart.
Mike, thank you very much. Quick question. One of the concerns, I think in a couple of the letters we had earlier today, or this evening, talked about having to switch from platform to platform to platform, and I noticed you'd mentioned the term platforms. Not my world, but tell me, what are we doing to try and make that almost seamless, if you will, if that's possible?
Yeah, it's something that, as Matt talks about, our planning for remote learning and hybrid learning and in-person learning moving forward. That is one of the key areas as winnowing down to fewer platforms. So again, when we made the transition to remote learning, we were thinking, okay, we don't have a lot of time to prep our teachers. We need to make sure that they're going to effectively use the tools that they're familiar with and that they've been using with their students. Now that we have more time to prepare, we need to narrow that down. We're hearing there's just way too many things out there for our families to be using, way too many things for our teachers, and then our ability to really say, what's the best way to deliver math instruction remotely? Well, this is the one or two things you should be doing. You shouldn't have a big, long laundry list. So part of that work will be happening in our planning as we move forward and through the summer so that we're much more tight and clear with the tools that we do use.
Okay, thank you.
Director Carlson?
So, thanks, Mike. I was wondering if you could throw slide 6 back up so that we can look at it together. I'm intrigued by this. Is this format for reporting on results too? We're still muddling through on this stuff, but the idea here is that instead of spending an evening on math and then an evening on English, that this is how this reporting would come out.
Well, I would actually recommend just because think about how much time we really have to dig into any one of these, and there's so much to unpack in these, that I would recommend, and I think as we were talking with the Aspen group, that next year we break these out and that we do a math report and we really kind of dig into it and talk about what are the things we're doing for math, because there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot more in the report that we have, including trend data for all these subgroups, the strategies that accompany them. So I would recommend we break it out. I just think that trying to do all this in one setting
Right.
Ideally, we would do that. This is our year that we've redone everything, and so
Yeah,
I
know
think
yeah. So
spacing
I'm not
them
so
out
much
is good.
worried about this year, but rather as we go forward, because in the last few years, I think the most useful analysis that I've seen on this topic was last year when you broke out the ELL. And were really able to show us that the ELL students who, while they're currently in ELL, and sorry, it's still, keep that slide up, please. That while the ELL students are still enrolled in ELL, their performance is not great in mathematics. But that post-ELL, they returned to a baseline so they weren't substantially different, which what that did for me is it allowed me to not worry about the ELL row here. I mean, it's all red. And I can say that I understand why they're red and it's acceptable because I know that our ELL program is working and it's bringing them to the standard that they can compete with all of the other students. This is great news. And yet, when I look at this particular graph, I see 4 other rows that are red: low income, SPED, Black African American, and Hispanic Latino, all of which would nominally be something I'm concerned about if I could disentangle them. And this is where things get really interesting. Power BI is powerful, but I can only ask the questions I'm allowed to ask. What I would very much like to be able to do for 3rd grade SBA in mathematics, I can see that we've got 270 Hispanic students who took it. Fantastic. I'd like to subtract out all of the Hispanic students who are ELL and see if you're Hispanic and non-ELL, how are you performing? And if I subtract out low income, how are we performing? The only thing I can do that for at present is the student growth percentile. And the student growth percentile for Hispanic is indistinguishable from white, Asian, or 2 or more races if you subtract out all of our special programs. So I'm not worried about the Hispanic row. I'm worried about the underlying factors that are enriched in the Hispanic row for the purposes of where should we be focusing interventions. And that's the sort of thing that I very much like to see when we come back to this, is trying to disentangle which programs are working. I mean, SPED, okay, is our SPED program working as well as it can? I believe our ELL program is working as well as it can. Therefore, it's not a concern to me that while they're in ELL, students are not performing very well. After they've gotten out of ELL, the program did its job. So anyway, to me, the most important part of this is not the blow by blow each cell in this table. It's about trying to get into the underlying factors. And so it sort of separates the question, how are we doing in this subject? On average, as you pointed out, we're doing fine in ELA. I'm more worried about math. That has not changed in the last 12 years. It's still something where I'd like to know what we can do to move the needle in math. But it's separate than the question of each of these rows for each of our programs. How well is it working? And that's really what I'd like to see as we evolve this reporting. I'd like to see it evolving towards which things do we need to intervene on, and which things are just byproducts of the factors that are contributing to them.
Yeah.
So,
and you may
households are obviously harder, but anyway, so that's my feedback on this report.
We broke out performance by disability category. And so again, the benefit of looking at these in smaller clusters allows us to go much deeper into our analysis of what might be the causative factors. Yeah. And there are people behind that too that are doing that analysis, but also thinking about what are the strategies and interventions that necessarily follow. And so when we try to report on 7 different academic areas, and then there's another results report coming in too, and try to do that all at once and try to share that in a board meeting. And again, it's remote, and a study session will probably be a better way to do this. I think it's going to be more in our interest to chunk it out and to really dig deeper into this. Because like you said, there's much more to unpack, particularly in math. There's other data we can look at as well as we think about inclusive practices, like how much students get access to general education curriculum. And so we can dig into that, but we're at 8 o'clock tonight and we're just scratching the surface here. So that's something we want to be thinking about as we move forward.
And the last piece of this table is when you show these guys, I would love to have a column in there that's the number. Because if you look at this Black African American and Hispanic Latino, don't look like they're all that different. there are 6 times as many kids in the Hispanic Latino row as there are in the Black African American. I mean, if you could move 12 kids in the Black African American row, poof, it looks like the Asian row.
Yeah,
Anyway.
that's all embedded in our report, and again, I think more opportunity to dig into those if we break it out.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. It's a lot of work here. I'm not discounting that, and this is a really weird time to be trying to do this work.
President Bleasner, we can take another hand, and then I'm going to switch. I'm going to ask for 1 minute for technical switchover that I think I have found a fix. And so, Cassandra, if you want to ask your question,
your
if it
hand,
goes dark,
Cassandra.
I'll be back. Oops, you have to unmute, Cassandra.
My apologies. Have we surveyed students to see what they feel they need to be successful with online learning?
Yep, and we are planning on continuing that. I think Matt will talk a little bit more about that later in this evening's discussion. We did an initial survey of families and students just for overall satisfaction, and then, as you know, we also surveyed students specifically around the grading system. We want to be thoughtful about making sure that we're addressing some of the strands.
Unknown participant is now joining.
So that's what we're doing right now. Then as we start to get these remote learning and hybrid learning and in-person learning plans more thoroughly developed, we're going to ask some very specific questions about those areas, and those will be asked of students and families and teachers and administrators. So Matt will talk more about that tonight, but yes, students are a very important part of that.
Do you think it's possible that, although it's limited data, the higher scores in art and technology could be, there isn't a language barrier as strong as there is in ELA or even trying to understand math and doing story problems? And because with technology, it's less cultural?
Yeah, I think those are all the things we want to unpack, particularly as we look at how students interact with curriculum and where they have success. Some people are saying right now that being able to take these large state assessments and set them aside for a little bit will allow us to actually look at some deeper measures of learning and how students are connecting with their learning. Not that we want to entirely eliminate them, but there may be some opportunities for us to be thinking about assessment in different ways in the coming year.
Thanks. I was just wondering if we can think about having that translate to other areas. That's all for now.
I guess, Dr. Stevem, you're making a switch for us?
Unknown
Nope,
participant is now exiting.
I already did it, and we are fine. You didn't even
Okay.
notice it. I just went poof and switched machines up on the screen.
Excellent, magic.
Yes, it was.
All right, so Mike, I just have a few questions. I was intrigued as I went looking through, and when you used grade C, regardless of which subject matter, it was pretty indicative. You had the same subgroups that performed. They might have performed slightly better, but you saw special education, you saw low income, you saw Latino, and you saw Black and African American. So it's clear that there's some systemic issues around this. It's not just an academic component. So I guess my concern is there's a clear pattern, and it's played out for years and decades. And we had some equity work that was going on, like the district equity teams that happening, as well as the school-based ones. And I was intrigued that even the tests, if I look at tests or if they got a C, so obviously our grading, what I didn't know was if you looked at that grading, were the kids who got a D or an F also the ones not passing those tests? And if that's the case, then we have an indicator in which to look at it. But I guess my big takeaway from this is we still have some underlying issues to work with, which are the equity, opportunity, and inclusion, which is more about our attitudes and our ways of approaching it. And that's a piece. I don't want to get that lost in subject matter, because I think it's some of the how we move this might be systemically, not subject matter.
Agreed, and that's going to be one of our areas as we think about professional learning and training for all of our teachers. And I think, as you know, Emily Young's coming in as the new director of professional learning. That's one of her key charges, is how do we continue that learning for our teachers, both in person but also remote. And I think there'll be some really wonderful opportunity as we look at our our learning management system, which is the way we deliver training to the teachers and adults in our district online, to really start to expand on that and give more people access to that learning. Because as you know, when we try to train all of our employees, when we have thousands of people in the district, there just are logistical challenges. Well, this learning management system will actually allow us to start providing more diverse training to more people. And so that will be an area that we continue to need to do, having people look at their biases, the way they're delivering instruction, how kids access learning, what are the best ways for kids to access learning that allows them to demonstrate their own competency and their own knowledge. And so I think there's some real opportunities, and I think some of those are going to be spurred on by the situation we're in. So yes, definitely still an area of growth for us, and still an area that we need to make sure there's lots of training and support for our teachers and the adults in our district.
The other piece I found interesting was the world language, because it was there that you saw the Latino students definitely were outperforming. Low-income students were actually at a much higher percentage. So I do think that's an interesting piece of, are there some strengths we could play into as well that can also help to impact those other academics? I appreciate wanting to focus math and science, I get that, or math and reading. At the same time, social studies really incorporates all those things, and it's the critical thinking and analysis that you have to do. Science really brings math and is applied and allows them to do that. So I guess I would be cautious not to lose those things going forward, because that problem-based learning can apply that foundational work.
No, I'm running, this thing died because it's not charging. Now it's on.
Yeah, we were just talking about that this morning, in fact, in our cabinet meeting of how do we continue to work to evaluate programs and evaluate interventions and strategies that we're using. And just like you said, initially you want to be evaluating the fidelity. How well are you implementing it the way it was designed to be implemented? Because if you don't do that, the results really could be influenced by so many different factors. So if you're comfortable that what we're doing it the right way, then you can go to that next tier. Now, are you starting to see gains? And that goes to the point I was making throughout, which is we need to start setting shorter term achievable targets that we're saying, okay, what would be reasonable to expect if you're doing the Lexia really well? What would you expect to see for these groups of students? And then let's make sure we're monitoring and reporting on that, as opposed to, well, we hope 90% of our students hit this target. Well, that doesn't, you don't have enough information to say that you're really on track unless you're monitoring at a smaller level or a more discrete level.
No, thank
So
you.
yes, it is something we're talking about, and it's, and as you know, Tim Krieger, just amazing. We're having conversations about how do we start doing that more systematically and really connecting the results to what we're doing.
That's great, thank you. And I see Director LaLiberty's hand is now up.
Yeah, Mike, could you, I'm looking at the grade 11 science data, where we're at, 21% overall. And I'm having a hard, I'm trying to understand, I'm looking at in the packet, the N for the number of students that I guess took the exam is not dramatically less than or fewer than our other exams. So can you just explain to me, what I see is 1,988 students as the N.
So that's the total number of students that were eligible to take the exam.
Oh, not that necessarily took it.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah, Eric, I can tell you with confidence that my senior and my freshman were not taking that exam. It was not required.
Yeah.
do we know how many students took the exam?
I don't have it here. I can find it out. Find out.
I mean, because when you look at benchmark, or compared to our benchmark districts, we are amongst the, we're 9th or 10th for all of these.
Yeah.
So my assumption then would be that we had one of the lowest rates of students taking the exam.
Yeah, some districts really made an effort to say to all kids, you will be there. We're going to set schedules so that you can be there. And we were actually, interestingly enough, we were having a conversation with our high schools about could we set schedules that allowed all students to access exams without having to take time off or miss a class or impact other grade levels. And now, again, with COVID, that threw everything up in the air. So if we think there's value in having every student take this assessment, then we could potentially reduce some of the barriers. On the other hand, as Chris was kind of alluding to, if it's not a graduation requirement, kids are demonstrating proficiency in other ways. Is that something we want to invest a lot of time and energy into creating?
Yeah, my inclination is no, but I was mostly curious as to the data. Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for Mike?
Oh, I do have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so it occurs to me as I'm thinking about this that our current indicators, they're not going to work next year, and they're probably not even going to be useful for several years. It's not like I don't think we're going to. My sense is we're not going to be able to go. They're not going to work next year. Probably can't go back to them 2 years from now even. Would you agree with that thought? I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and I think that's why having what we're calling a progress monitoring and a universal screen, we have a new assessment tool that we've evaluated and we're ready to start using. Again, just good timing and good planning. We were saying we needed it anyway, and now we need it more than ever. So that will allow us to assess K-8 for literacy and math, and to actually look at our kids making the right amount of progress to make at least a year's worth of growth over the course of their time in school. So I will most likely want to include that in future results. In addition, I think those grades are going to be something we're going to need to keep an eye on too, because we know right now we have students that aren't connecting to remote learning. And so if they're not doing that, they're not going to be passing those classes. And I would anticipate there's going to be a dip in that as well that we're going to want to monitor and say, how do we continue to keep kids earning grades and getting credit and learning the content of the courses as a result.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? Is that all right, Director Bleasner?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, please do.
Mike, the assessment you just mentioned, I think I heard the word growth in there. Is the idea that there'd be an assessment at the beginning of the year and then one at the end of the year?
Yeah, so the idea is every kid gets assessed at the beginning. In other years, when we have state assessments, you can use those and say kids who had 3s and 4s are probably okay, but we want to make sure there's some kind of way to universally assess every kid in the system. Then for the kids that are below a certain point, you say, we need to check their progress periodically. For most, that might be 2 to 3 checks throughout the whole year, but for some, it would be more frequent, maybe every 4 to 6 weeks, some even more frequently than that. And in those times, you're expecting them to make certain amounts of growth, and those are all mapped out on this tool that we have. So you can say, if you're above the trend line, good to go. If you're below, you need to adjust your interventions and your approaches. So they're really robust, rich systems. To be quite blunt, we should have had something like this in place long ago, and for many reasons we didn't. So it's about time, and more than ever, it's going to be very helpful for us.
I mean, that data seems extraordinarily more meaningful than what the data that we're relying on now to actually understand what we are doing as a district and the impact we're having. Okay, that's good.
All right, Director.
All right, hey, silver lining out of this thing, right?
Yeah, real quick question, Mike, and maybe I just missed it earlier. What are the raw numbers of the kids that we just can't reach, period? Is it, a handful? Is it more than 100? What? I'm just not clear.
It's about 8%, just no contact with whatsoever. We're finding, though, that there are kids that are engaging at the high school level. I was just looking at data tonight. 4 or more of their classes, they're pretty high rates. Like some of our schools were hitting 90%, 92%. But when you start looking at 3 classes, checking out of some, those numbers get pretty concerning. And so we're going to be meeting with our high school principals tomorrow to talk about that. There are kids that are saying, I'm really focusing on these really core important classes, but there are some that they're saying, for whatever reason, I'm not going to connect with.
Okay. Well, I guess the question then, it becomes a question then of the idea of going to the 7 periods that we did, which I thought was a great idea to keep the pressure off of kids. Is it not a reality, or not a smart reality in this offline world, or online world, I should say?
Yeah, I think that's, and some of our parent comments pointed to that tonight. What can you actually attend to in a remote setting? And, whether it's 7 periods that we keep, but we think about staggered schedules, like some of the comments tonight, I think that's still to be determined. But in some way to reduce the ability or the need to focus on lots of things over periods of time, whether that's a year, a semester, a quarter, or shorter, I think it's something we're going to have to look at in remote settings. In an in-person setting, I think the jury was still out. I think we were feeling on balance. It made a lot of sense in person.
Is it possible that in one of those periods, or however many, that we could include a class that would be more social emotional learning that might help aid them in the remote world, or might help them get through the issues they might be having stuck at home, so to speak?
Yeah, I think there are going to need to be a lot of different things on the table, and we're going to be sharing a results report that deals with a lot of the social emotional aspects. And I know Johnny Fu and Matt Gillingham and their teams have been working very closely on that, including not only, like you said, class, meetings, but also curriculum as well. And more than anything, we're hearing about that in-person connection with an adult, and what are the different ways that we can do that, because that human-to-human connection and even that student-peer connection is one of those things we're going to need to be looking at too.
Thanks, sir.
Any other questions of Mike Van Orden? Okay, with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. I appreciate that. And now we move to the second phase after the presentation, which is actually the acceptance and approval of the monitoring report. If you remember, we have the 2 steps. So at this point, it's more of, do we agree with the report that's being presented as it's been forward, as reasonable progress with exceptions as it's been put forward. So I will now entertain a motion for the board to approve the monitoring report for results 2, academic content, knowledge, and skills as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Been moved by Director Carlson and seconded by Director Sage to approve the report as presented. Is there any discussion on that?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just one thing. I agree. I'll be voting for the motion. The one thing that was helpful in looking at all of these at once is it's clear that across, regardless of topic area, grade, there is a large and growing achievement gap for our low-income students that is not closing, that is widening. And I hope soon we'll see a report that has a closing gap, a dramatically closing gap.
Director Stewart has his hand up.
Director Stewart, thank you.
Yes, following up on Eric's line of thought pattern, I'd like to think that there might be some way that we can go to specifically addressing income as opposed we've talked about inclusion, we've talked about our equity issues, but there seems to always be a lacking of being able to zero in on income. And I don't know if there's a specific research institution, academic group that really just looks at income, period, regardless of what the race is, regardless of the language barrier, or inclusive of it, to be quite frank, but that could really focus in on the income. And in such a well-to-do, if you will, district as ours, for us not to be able to reach those kids, I'm sorry, I'm just beyond words at that point, because I come from that group, okay? And it just ticks me off we can't get to them.
Any other questions or comments? So what I'd like to do is to do a quick based on the conversation that's taken place and some of the things, what I'm hearing is it's reasonable progress with exceptions, and we're speaking to those specific groups. It would be the low income group, Black African American, Latino group, as well as special education. So those ones that sort of highlighted out from there. And in agreement that would be looking forward to having those shorter term targeted goals to be able to go forward with. Are you in agreement that that is true? I see two heads nodding. I guess you guys can raise a hand. Okay. And is there any other key thing that we want to, I need to just write a summary at the bottom of it. So I'm trying to get those key summary points based on this conversation. I mean, those are the things that I say. I will say, I think there are some systemic challenges we need to do and think systemically. And I would say that in regards to race, in regards to income, in regards to inclusion. I think those are all very systemic, and I think that comes out in our data. Anything else? Director Carlson.
I agree with all the dimensions you've defined there. I would just add that I concur with the concern that Mike had expressed around math performance, that it's not as acceptable as our ELA performance.
I think you have an opportunity next year to look at things in a completely different way.
Yep.
It's circumstantial, but it's also been what's needed. And so I think, there's a number of things now after this initial pass that you have the opportunity to refine next year. And that overall, the achievement stays high. It's still that focus that all of you are looking for to really narrow in on those areas that haven't shown growth. So think about that next year for the indicators with the benchmarking tools that you're having, because then you can just focus in on those groups that you are most concerned about. And I think you have to let go some of the how's everybody doing and really focus in on how are the ones who need us the most doing. That's just my opinion.
Well said.
Which I won't be here to
Thank
say
you.
anymore.
No, we're going to let the board, this is the board's time.
I know it's the board's
so I
time.
will remind you of that, Dr. Stevem. Thank
Cassandra
you.
has her hand up. She's on the board.
Yes, Director Sage, please.
I would just like to add, and I don't know if we capture this here or somewhere else, that we were scheduled to have equity training for the board, and I know a lot of district staff, and that was canceled because it was Marchish. I would be interested as a board member in having a replacement online training now and then doing that in-person training when we can, because I don't know what it's like to be the special education student. I know what it's like to be the special education student's mother. I can't identify or relate with some of the gaps, and I think it would help me personally if I had some more professional development.
Excellent. All right, we can put that into the work plan for next year. I'm assuming people are in agreement? Okay. Any other questions or comments? Director La Liberty, you're muted if you wanted to talk.
Yeah. Only that we as a board need to sooner than later determine what our indicators are going to be for next year. We need to have that conversation, I think, soon. So, okay, that's it.
Yes, and that will be in partnership working with staff along the lines as to what, because actually they will be setting those indicators and forwarding those to us, and then we'll have that discussion at that time.
That's right. I just think, that should happen soon rather than, next winter.
Yes, ideally it will take place between now and the end of August. How's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I will write that on the list of activities. Any other discussion around the report? All right. So with that, I will call for the vote. So as it was moved and seconded, all those to, as presented with the exceptions as stated on the cover sheet, all those in favor, please signify by voting aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. All right, well, thank you very much for that robust discussion around all the different components. There's a lot of work to do. I think there's a lot that has been done and provides. I think this is not new information, honestly, it's what I would say. We've had it and we're working towards it. There's still just more to do. So appreciate the continued focus. And with that, we will now move to the superintendent's report
Yes. Can you
and
hear
have
me?
another update. It is 8:30. Keep hanging in there, guys. Good job.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because I'm working with multiple things going here at once, and I have an echo here, but if you're hearing me okay, then I'm going to keep going. So for superintendent's report tonight, Matt Gillingham's going to share briefly kind of just the beginning bones of our planning. And one of the public comments tonight that had a long list of things is only, this much of all of the things that we are thinking of and that we have to think of. What's going to be difficult about this is you already are seeing plans flowing around across the nation, from state departments to health organizations to vendors and everybody in between. What we're trying to do is digest the best of the best and put it into a framework that will work for Lake Washington, doing that alongside of the guidance that's issued at the state level. OSPI has a statewide, very large task force that is working to probably provide some menus, but we're going to still have to take all of those things and distill it down into our plan. We know there's opinions all over the place and ideas, and we welcome all of those. But ultimately, the responsibility lies with all of us to create what that next iteration is going to look like of school, knowing there's emotions, there's academics, there's all kinds of considerations. The complexity of coming back to learning is far more complex than coming and closing. So I just want people to understand that this is the beginning pieces. We're not going to be putting out a plan next week that says, here's what we're doing, because it's way, way too early. So we want to be clear about what we're presenting tonight. It's not the plan. It's the framework that we're using for organizing the thinking of our district to begin putting the meat on the bones to then arrive at a plan, probably in maybe late July, August. But we're stepping this forward because at any point we know the variables can change. So we just want to be really crystal clear about that tonight. So Matt is going to kind of present our beginning work on this, and I know he's going to do so in a very efficient manner.
I think there is a saying, brevity is the soul of wit, so I will aim to be witty. So I think we've heard a lot tonight. I know that in kind of imagining what might be possible for returning to learning in the fall. I think we're all hoping for the best case scenarios that we're able to reopen school in some fashion that looks as close as possible to what we're used to, recognizing that we'll have a lot of mitigating efforts that will need to go into play. We're also going to have to think about our priorities of how do we really intentionally rebuild the community that's been disrupted. How do we might talk about assessing where our students are at, not just from an academic standpoint, but also from a well-being standpoint. It's going to be more important than ever for us to kind of help students re-engage in routines, both for their well-being, but then also for us to be thinking about if there is a disruption to the school year at some point in time, that we've taught routines in such a way that would allow us to pivot to back to an online environment. There's also certainly we're going to be getting guidance from OSPI and about what are some of those potential hybrid options that we'll need to evaluate as a district, and of course conditions could change throughout the coming months that will force us to kind of reevaluate. So I'm going to share what I hope will be just kind of a brief presentation looking at our initial thinking around that, and I use the title Structuring for Resiliency because I think there are so many unknowns around what we're going to be facing in this coming year. There are so many unknowns about what our staff and what our students and what our families are going to be facing. And so what we're really thinking about right now is not just what are the things that we need to decide, but how do we structure ourselves so that we're able to respond should there be changes in guidance, should there be a change in kind of the what's happening on the ground, and so that we're able to be resilient as an organization, we're able to help our students be resilient, and we're able to really meaningfully offer continuous learning regardless. So I want to talk just briefly about some of the major decision points, and I had a conversation with one of our principals last night, where there's so many things that we're automatic about. So certain ceremonies, rituals, turning materials in, things that we've developed procedures over the years that really don't require a lot of mental or bandwidth or planning time or anything, just to do the operation of school. And as we look at the end of the school year and still having to factor guidance around whether we still going to be in phase 1, might we be in phase 2, each one of these operational decisions requires a lot of planning and thinking and comparing to the guidance and working with stakeholders both internally and externally. So every decision that we're making right now it's almost as if we've made it for the first time and takes a lot of time and work. Right now we just issued some guidance to our school just on how to close out the year. How do they collect materials back in a way that keeps our students and families safe and keeps our staff safe as well. Mike talked a lot about having to reimagine what summer looks like, and we have a whole new category, these incompletes that our high school students will be in that we have to figure out. And then we need to go ahead and look at the fall. And it's not just what the model might look like, but it's also how are we preparing our principals and our teachers and our staff around the needs that our students are going to come back to us with. Mike talked a little bit about screening and saying how are we going to figure out where our community's at, and how we think about all these mitigation efforts that that are in an environment that's very difficult, dynamic, and challenging with hundreds of students moving around. So we've got a lot of things that we'll be deciding. That seems to be the new norm, is having to make lots of big decisions on a daily basis. So as we look to say, well, how are we going to go about doing that? And I think one of the things that we've been reflecting is looking back to say, well, how do we do at making decisions this past spring? We were put on emergency footing in March. We had an emergency operations center. We figured out kind of what aspects of our organization worked really well, where maybe we had some misses, and how do we learn from that? And so what we're really focused on is saying, how do we map out how we're going to make decisions moving forward, and what are some of those key things that we should be thinking about? Dr. Staven mentioned that there's a number of different roadmaps out there. We're starting to see different state education agencies issuing guidance, and so we've been looking at that. One that is particularly comprehensive that we like is the Return to School Roadmap. It doesn't fit everything that doesn't fit the context for everything that we are doing as a school district. In some areas, we can check all the boxes right now, and yet we know that that's not sufficient, that there's more that we can do for our students. But it provides us kind of a nice roadmap. And what that roadmap really says is that school districts should be looking at their governance. They should be looking at how they're making decisions, what's driving those decisions, and how they're socializing those decisions. Secondly, schools really need to pay attention to the wellness of their students and their staff, and provide some guidance around how to do that. thinking about instruction, Mike talked a lot about both kind of how we screen and assess where our students are at, but also in a very dynamic situation, how do we maybe kind of reduce the playbook a little bit so that we can ensure greater consistency, that we can make it easier for all of our students and families and teachers to be able to access. A unique aspect that honestly is not one that as a school district we've typically invest a lot of time and energy in is what about our graduating seniors once they graduate? What type of supports might this class have in connecting to post-secondary, their post-secondary plans that's unique than from other classes that have come before them? Certainly then also a number of technology, facilities, and operational pieces that we'll need to work through. I'm going to spend most of the time talking a bit about the governance piece because really that's the part where as we structure that well, that's going to help us make better decisions in all the other areas. So when we think about governance, the roadmap will make some recommendations, one of which is launching a return to school committee. And so we've started an internal, within our central leadership team, forming a return to school committee. And that's an interdisciplinary committee that really pulls from all parts of the organization. Because what we've really learned through kind of the past few months is that a decision made one place really has an impact in other areas. And so when we look at whether it's providing food services, the interdependency in the relationship with our transportation department and with our equity department and with our communication department, actually if they're really all connected and working well together, we've been able to enhance services week over week as a result of that. So we want to make sure that we have kind of, if you picture a beach ball, we have somebody that's able to represent kind of each color of the beach ball as our organization so that we're not missing things. Thinking about kind of what are some of the values that drive the organization, we can look to our board policies around that and a lot of our foundational documents. But doing some work to translate that in this time, how do those values translate into kind of a very dynamic learning environment? Also really thinking about what is they call it a pandemic response committee, but that's really like how does our emergency operations committee have to evolve in order to be able to support us in real time moving forward. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. Looking back at our emergency plans, how do we adapt those? I think we actually have some really good emergency plans that we can rely on, but we now have an opportunity to say, how do they have to translate to this environment when we've got a little bit of a breathing room? We're, of course, going to scenario plan too. We may be given some latitude and some options, and so what we'll have to do is do some scenario planning and play out a lot of what ifs and be thinking through those in advance. That was something that we didn't have the opportunity to do this spring. And so we are able to return to school as close to normal as possible, but with the possibility that we might have to make adjustments on kind of in a very quick time frame. We want to be able to scenario plan through that. And of course, working with key stakeholders, I think that's particularly important as we think about gathering kind of the values and the interests of stakeholders to be able to work into that, and thinking about that being kind of a regular and ongoing dialogue because the things on the ground can really change, and we might have to make some very fast decisions. And so having kind of really open lines of communication is going to be really important. So when we look at kind of what does that structure look like, what we're kind of aligning internally is we're forming an interdisciplinary return to school committee that's a subset of our central leadership team. Our central leadership team plays a key role in helping kind of expand the thinking of this group as well as vetting their thinking. But really what we're looking to is this group to identify what needs to happen as far as the planning and actually be developing the plans, proposals, or guidance for that work. And then cabinet's in a role of really being able to kind of vet and help make connections for that work. Off to the side, we will be reconstituting our Emergency Operations Center as an Emergency Coordination Center. And this group is also an interdisciplinary group that what we're going to have them focus on this spring is really do their kind of planning and preparation as a team, so that when we start up in the fall, they're able to provide daily monitoring and immediate response to anything that comes up during that day, and also helping flag any changes of guidance or things that are going on, so that they're going to be the group that's really kind of attending to the here and now. Our return to school committee is looking forward and saying, kind of how do we plan for these future possibilities. We're also going to start intentionally really doing some stakeholder engagement in that forward-looking kind of vein with our different employee groups, with our administrators, parents, and with our students. And that's going to include some options for surveys. We'll be doing a thought exchange. But it's also going to be including some dialogues and some virtual exchanges. And so we're working and kind of roughing out what that looks like. We want to make sure that it's inclusive and that we have some opportunities to make sure that we're getting lots of different voices, but it also needs to be light enough that we can maintain kind of regular contact, frequent contact to help us make very quick decisions as we move forward. And one of the key parts of this is that it's a very iterative process. So normally we have our central leadership team meets on a monthly basis. We're actually meeting, all these groups are meeting on a weekly basis in order to kind of have this iterative exchange of ideas, working through plans and vetting them, and then being able to move forward. So right now, we're really kind of focusing on how do we want to be making decisions in a way that's making sure that we're not missing anybody. I'm going to briefly just highlight what are some of the things as we look forward that we're going to be needing to think about. Well-being or wellness is definitely one of them. So thinking about our crisis response, we have a crisis response plan that's in place. We're going to need to revisit that and say, does that look any different now in the midst of a pandemic than it did pre-pandemic? We've actually, I think, done a really nice job and really appreciative of the work of Johnny Fu, kind of helping to push and expand services with our community partners. And so we're going to need to continue to push on that to meet the needs of our community. Looking at what is it that our staff need? I think that's kind of a new and important question for us to wrestle with. We know when we're talking about social emotional learning that the adult development and their social emotional skills is important if they're going to be able to support students. Thinking about how we provide resources both for staff and students around self-care, and then also I think we're going to have to be very intentional about how to help parents aid their children in going back to school. I had a moment the other day. I had to drive to Bellevue. I live at kind of the north end of the lake, and it was the farthest I've driven in 2 months, and I had a moment of anxiety, and then I kind of had to reflect that I think we're all going to, both adults and children, we're going to be going back through some moments. It's going to take us some time to be able to transition back into some sense of normalcy. And of course, we're going to need to provide guidance around how to address physical health responses. And so we'll look to see what guidance we're getting from the CDC or from the state. But we're going to ultimately have to develop our own kind of local plans and decisions. Instructionally, I think Mike's talked quite a bit about this, and it really fit really nicely with the R2 report, which is we already know that we have gaps in our learning, and we know that we have students that are not participating. Mike mentioned about 8% of our students right now are not participating in continuous learning. And so we can go into the school year recognizing that we will have students at very different places from where we would normally expect them. We're not only going to have to make some decisions around how to provide the right types of interventions, but also some decisions around prioritization. around that, because we're going to be balancing a lot of different needs to attend to students' well-being, a sense of community, as well as their instructional needs. Post-secondary, I mentioned a little bit earlier, and so this will be one that we will be taking a close look at over the next couple of weeks and saying, what is it that our seniors need, and what type of support can we offer to be able to help them transition into their post-secondary pathway of choice. So the Return to School Roadmap identifies a number of ways in which school districts can do that, and so we'll be working to evaluate each of those items as we move forward. Facilities, I think this is one that we really early on in the pandemic where our support services team was really great about evaluating options, gathering materials for us to be able to try to stay in operations as long as possible. As we play out a much longer game, that's going to change. We're going to have some different kind of calculations around that. And so we'll have the opportunity over the next couple of months to kind of revisit what we developed and say, in light of a whole school year, what does that look like, and how does that change, and what's the relation to how that needs to change our operations, our routines, our procedures, or what activities are or aren't allowed. We think about school operations, this is largely in thinking about kind of what are some of the policies and procedures that are in a completely different environment. So thinking about our school schedules, particularly as we start to see what guidance we may be getting from OSPI around various hybrid options. We'll have to look at that. Thinking about liability has been a big thing that we've been looking at in terms of particularly as we start to open up, and where kind of what level of risk that as an organization we can take on. Thinking about extracurriculars and activities, it really breaks my heart that our students aren't able to be together in community, being able to move and do things that give so many of them joy. So that's going to be a whole other thing that we'll be evaluating. We got to hear from the WA today, and so we'll be looking forward to see what kind of guidance they give us, but then also we have a lot of autonomy locally that we'll be able to make some decisions. Certainly transportation could be a very interesting and unique challenge. Should physical distancing requirements remain in place for school children? And of course, given the volume of usage, how we keep those clean. So, and then finally, technology. We did quite a bit. Our technology operations did some amazing work this spring in getting hotspots and laptops out, and increasing essentially our bandwidth to provide instructional services. We'll have to kind of be going through a process to assess that, particularly looking at where students were unable to access, and look at how we can improve that for the coming year. And I think, as Mike talked about too, also thinking about how we kind of consolidate and centralize some of our resources to make it a little bit more user-friendly for our families. So as Dr. Savim said, we've got a lot of decisions coming ahead of us, and so we're not in a position to really announce what those are at this time. We're even still trying to wrap up some things for the end of this school year, but using this roadmap, thinking about our organizational structure, we're trying to put ourselves in a position to be able to dynamically respond to whatever guidance we get from the state. OSP has indicated that we should expect that in June, but they've just kind of begun that work, and it's a very big group that they're working with. So we'll hopefully be in a good position to be able to respond to that whenever that comes.
End of June is what we've heard, or even later. So I wouldn't expect it to be out anytime soon. Chris, you had a hand up. Thank you, Matt.
No, I just want to say thank you, Matt, and thank you to the team who are trying to do this. I wanted to build on two things. The first is, this evening in our public comment, you heard at least one person who's expressing a concern about, are we coming back to school at the end of September? in September. I cannot express the other parameter is, as the parent of a senior, being told, oh, we're making a plan causes it freaks us out. Helping us understand that you understand our problem is what we need. And I'm a little worried that in your 12 slides, communication was mentioned twice and wasn't its own slide. Communication with stakeholders is not what you need. You need communication to all 30,000 parents in this district, because they are all going to be freaking out by the time that we get to June 1st about what the hell are we going to do in the fall, if they aren't already. And I'm just expressing that as a parent who's been through this. Those of us with a graduating kid have already been through this once, because there's this big thing where it's not going to happen, and oh my God, what are we going to do? The panic is palpable. If we get past graduation, we get past the end of school, and there's not an official statement that here's what we're hoping we can do. We understand. We want to be back in school. If we're allowed to be back in school, we're making a plan that will allow us to be back in school. But that, not promising we will be back in school, but simply promising people that you appreciate that. You've got to get ahead of the anxiety on this one, because we failed to do that, at least in my neck of the woods, on the 12th graders, and it's killing. So, communication.
So one thing that we're doing is making, as we've kind of have the branding, if you will, of the information that's out there. This will be another landing spot where we'll be posting regular information and pushing something out to everybody weekly. Even if it says we don't know yet, because people will hear everything. And I think the other thing that's already interesting to observe, and we will see more of, is that this is a very polarizing kind of thinking right now that's happening around just returning to life in all kinds of areas, not just school. It's businesses, it's sporting events, and you have don't go out, it's not safe, and who are you kidding? We have to get back to life as we knew it, open up the doors and go. So I think we also have to navigate the fact that there are very strongly held opinions and beliefs around all of what reopening school looks like. So that's part of it.
And just acknowledge that. That's the important part, because they're both right. And the thing is, they're both wrong. There's absolutely no way we're going back to school in September like we did last September. Yeah. It's going to be a different game when we get there. Absolutely. It's going to have different parameters on it. So it's going to be very interesting to watch it play out. But just over-communicate to the community. We need to get ahead of this yesterday on the communication side, because otherwise it's just going to be, if we get to the point, if we get to even to the end of the June, if we get into the summer and there isn't some statement that we are not just we're making a plan. We've got a plan for how to make a plan. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, we know how important it is to get kids back into school. We've experienced this just like you have. It's not optimal. I mean, earlier this evening, we had comments from people who were saying that the SPED kids are not getting their education that they deserve. That's true, but that's true of literally every kid who is receiving their education at school, at home. Right. It's not the same. It's not the same quality. It's not the same value. It's something. It's better than nothing. But expressing that so the community can at least understand that we understand where they're coming from. And that is what has failed to happen on the graduation side, is that the parents, the seniors, have not had any sense that we understand where they're coming from. And it's leading to issues in my neck of the woods.
Cassandra's hand is up.
So a bit of a question on the students who have had zero connection as far as the mental health and well-being. Am I talking to the right person, Matt?
Oh,
that's your area, right?
What's that? Yeah, that's my area.
Okay, all right. Are we following up with those students? I know we're following up with them. That was a silly thing to say. When does it get to the point of a welfare check?
Yeah, so I've surveyed all of our schools to look at how are our schools following up. All of our schools have indicated that when students aren't responding, that calls are going home, emails are going home. Most of them are also using interpreters if the student, the home language is a language other than English. From there, we get a little bit of variation. Some schools are using actual physical letters, and some schools are doing welfare checks. And when we refer to welfare checks, those are welfare checks by school resource officers or police officers. We've actually had more of our schools having staff members go out to visit schools. And I think it's important for when we talk about a welfare check to understand the context in which our schools would use a welfare check. It's nice to be able to have the ability to use that, but it's also a resource that needs to be used with some discretion. So when we have students who have historically been truant, or there's some other mitigating factors that give us cause to, like when students don't show up to school, we don't necessarily send out a resource officer or police officer. It's usually there's other compounding factors, mitigating factors, either the student's engaged in truancy, a truancy proceeding, or that there's something that we know about that student's actual situation that gives us some real cause for their concerns around that student's actual welfare. I think some of the things when we also look at our engagement. One of the nice things that Tim was able to pull for us was looking at the home language. And so we're seeing some disparities in engagement level on the basis of language. And so I think we also have, we have some families that are struggling or having some challenges and have kind of gotten a little bit insular, and some of those families may not necessarily welcome having a police officer come to their home. So I think as our school staff are looking at who's not engaging, they're also having to use what they know about that student and that family to make that determination on whether that's going to be a call and a resource that's going to be helpful, or if there's other things that they know where that actually might be counterproductive, and that they're trying to use other methods first. As Mike mentioned, we're actually meeting with all of our secondary principals tomorrow and going through and looking at their engagement data. We still have 1 month of learning left to go. And we want to make sure that we're making a really good push to try to reconnect with students. First, to know that are the students okay from a welfare standpoint, and secondly is what can we do to get them engaged with their learning. So it is a tool that is a resource that our schools know how to use, and some of them have used it, but it's also one that they want to use with some discretion, and not necessarily just because the student's not engaging.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Mark, your hand is up.
Yes, I'm a little concerned that we're painting too optimistic of a picture of knowing even by the end of June. The WASDA called today, the State School Directors Association, think that they're actually seeing OSPI even being later in the summer. So I think that as we move through and we communicate with parents, we need to be talking in a more realistic term. I'd love to see June 30 roll around and have all of a sudden the tablets fall and have us all know the word to go with. But I'm very concerned that we might be setting up some unrealistic expectations. That work group is enormous. It's like 160 people from OSPI, from around the state, and with all different players. It's hard enough to get a board of 5 to agree to something, let alone a group of 160 people. So anyway, I just want to paint that a little bit clearer, and I can't agree more with Chris, the idea that the more communications, the better. I would also suggest that as we push our communications out, we not only push them onto our pages that we would normally do so, but also onto the pages where the parents are congregating, whether it's the closed groups that are out there that many of us are on, or the neighborhood groups, the neighborhood association groups. just to make sure that we're actually reaching out, as opposed to having an expectation of them to actually look at our stuff and come to ours, if you will. The other issue is...
Yeah, and Mark, before you move on from there, I just want to be really super clear. We don't have an expectation that we will know by the end of June. That's when we hope we get some of that guidance from that group, but I agree it may be way later, but I just want to be clear, we don't believe we will have a solid plan by the end of June.
Good. I'm misinterpreting what you said. I'm glad we clarified it, because if I misinterpreted, God knows anybody else might too. On the checks on the kids, calling it a welfare check, I know that's to me a very official, almost legal term. I'd as much as those are necessary with many kids, I say many, a good portion of them. I'd love to be able to see us being able to reach out, as you mentioned, with the teachers to the kids, or for that matter, the teachers who know the kids and know their peers, and say, I know that John is a good friend with Eddie or whatever, and reach out in an indirect way to find out if they know anything. To me, it might be a softer way of doing it, and perhaps a better social emotional way of doing so that would be cause less apprehension than a resource officer knocking on the door. I just encourage you, if we have that option, I'd love to see us take it.
I'm going to say John, and then Siri, you want to wrap us up?
Sure.
I think I also want to just recognize what Chris said, that we may not have information about returning to school or what that exactly looks like, but it's kind of that empathy side of this whole matter of ensuring that our families know that we know, that they know that we understand what they're going through, and that we actually, well, yes, planning for a plan, they probably don't want to hear about that. But what Matt didn't go into tonight is they're actually getting very tactical in their work already around things that we do know about, that we do need to be thinking about. And so being as transparent with what we know, decisions that have been made, and just kind of laying out a roadmap so that parents know what to expect and when to expect it. And if we don't have information, just being upfront about that, and just so parents know, so they can kind of make their plans both mentally and physically, because if when school looks different in the fall, every family is going to have to figure out their unique situation, just like they did this spring.
Yeah, this is just really complex stuff. And so we want to have the very best odds and get feedback. And we also know that our families in our community are doing some version of this, perhaps in their other environments like healthcare and business and corporate, and some places that have strategies that we can also learn from. So we'll be asking people to have an opportunity to give us ideas, as well as just informing, because we think there's probably some things we can learn too that are going on in other worlds parallel to us that would be beneficial for us to be able to incorporate.
Okay, and I guess I can wrap up at this point. I want to say I think the challenge is, and I think, John, you hit on that, is just how do you make sure that you have enough of an outline, that the information's coming through and you set expectations clearly. And so as I think through this, maybe you won't have a full plan by June 30th, but what would we have by June 30th? And so that if that can get laid out, then there's some expectations that, okay, we'll have a decision about X by this point in time. And recognizing OSPI and what happens, I think in the foster system, they are always working two pathways: the plan to reunify with parents and the plan for adoption. And you carry both of those simultaneously, and you plan for both. And that's sort of the situation I think that we're in, is you have to plan for all. And the more you can just outlay in those key points, I think the framework was very beneficial to sort of give that outlay. And then now, what are some of the targets and deadlines around actually having things into place would be helpful on that website to at least have access to. It's uncertainty that makes people concerned. under promise, over deliver, right? That's the whole thing. So set those expectations that your community knows and can respond to. So it's going to be a tough time. It's moving constantly. And as we learn more about the illness and impacts on people and transmission and what happens, that's all going to impact what we can do within our schools. Some we'll have control over, some we won't. And it's recognizing where we do. So I guess I would say, as you look through these plans, really think about what do we as a district have control over, and really could say, yeah, we're going to do this. And what don't we, and we have to wait a little bit and sort of lay those pieces out. So I appreciate that's a lot of work. That an emergency and closing is one step. There's always the piece of how do you open is the next one. And you see this discussion nationwide amongst countries, honestly. Of how do you do this. So it's a tough road, but lots of people out there, lots of good people working on it, just communicating it, I do think is going to be our key.
Yes. And just so you know, as part of the end of my report, since I only have a couple board meetings left, I believe my goal is to make each of them successfully longer so that I can soak up every last board meeting that we have. So just going to put that out there.
You succeeded well this evening.
Thank you. I knew we would have a full plate, and I don't think they are going to get any less full. So get your screen eyes going. That is the end of the reports tonight.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that very full agenda. With that, we do have one last wrapping up, which is board member comments. Is there anything anybody wants to comment on or share? Director Sage.
And this is an upbeat sort of a thing, so think about this. We have until June 7th to submit a presentation to WASDA for the annual conference. And as the second largest school district in the state, and as a district who has resources, I would like to suggest that we do a presentation and that we talk with Dr. Holman about what he feels is one of our biggest strengths to bring forward and to share with other districts.
I think that's a great idea, Director Sage.
Great. Let me think about that and put some pen to paper. I presented at WASDA in 2016 and learned a lot from that presentation. So I have a bit of history that I can share with the group as well.
Well, you're overdue.
We're right on time.
Director Stewart, I thought your hand was up. Did you lower it?
No, ma'am, it is up, and I think that just remind folks that a framework for planning is what we refer to down home as fixing to get ready. So it's time to fixing to get ready time.
All right. Any other comments? Director LaLiberty.
Just a comment on the agenda tonight in the meeting. I actually found that this went fine. I know it was a longer meeting. I don't know. It didn't feel grueling to me.
Good.
And I thought this worked really well. I think we're getting better and better as a group of doing these. So, my 2 cents.
Brevity doesn't mean quality.
Okay.
Yes. Any other comments? The only one we didn't do government relations was not on the. So one of the things that there's WASDA is also requesting any new positions for the legislature. So there was an email sent on that. If there was something specific within legislative actions for next year that you want WASDA to be able to support as a position, now is the time to submit a proposal for that. So if anybody has something that they have thought of and would like to pursue, let Eric know. You can always write the proposal. I believe they're due the 20th though, so they're just 2 days away. So
we can also support somebody else's submission. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Typically, we do a lot of partnering with Bellevue, Issaquah, North Shore, and looking through those resolutions. They have one right now that they're looking at in regards to school funding and for the next year, and just trying to ensure keeping it whole for next year and not doing a midterm cut. Anybody else with a comment? If not, then I'm going to move on, and we will have our next board meeting will be held on June 1st. We will be remote still on June 1st. We have not heard any final, if the OPMA will be extended or not. At this point, it's set to expire on the 31st. So we're going to go ahead with virtual on the 1st, and then we can make a decision as to what happens on the 8th based on the information that comes out in the next few weeks. So the 1st will be a board meeting at 5 p.m. and then on June 8th, we have a scheduled study session at 5 p.m. That will be budget oriented. And with that, I'll now entertain a motion to adjourn our May 18th board meeting.
So moved.
Nobody wants to leave.
Oh, I'm trying to move.
You're doing a nice job, Chris. Do I have a second?
Second.
Hey,
Excellent. Been moved by Director Carlson, seconded by Director Stewart to adjourn the meeting. All those in favor, please signify by voting aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
good night.
Yeah, I'm opposed.
With that, meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Good night.